Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales and Part 2 of the Vikings. At the end of Part 1, I mentioned the multitudinous errors, misconceptions, misrepresentations, and misunderstandings about those people known wrongly in itself as the Vikings. So, in Part 2, I will look at more of those historical errors, as well as general Old Norse subjects. To begin with, let us look at one of the most popular misconceptions about the Vikings. Their supposed hatred of Christianity. Oh yes, they wanted to wipe the faith from distant Palestine off the face of the earth. They hated Christians simply because they were Christians, that's it. They hated them. They were actually... No, they didn't. To put it bluntly, they really couldn't have given a rat's ass about Christianity as such. Oh, yes, but they raided churches and monasteries. Those were their favourite targets, yes. Irish monks even had to build special tall, inaccessible round towers to hide in when the Vikings came. Yes, everyone knows that. Yes, they did. They did indeed raid those places. Religious institutions were their favourite targets. But for the same reason a modern burglar breaks into an obviously wealthy house rather than a run-down, dilapidated one that clearly contains nothing of value, nothing worth the trouble of even taking to the pawn shop. Most of the wealth in those times, you see, was held by the church. Yes, churches and monastic institutions were filled with gold and silver objects, precious stones, donations of money from the faithful, helping for a front row seat in heaven, rich fabrics and the like. And priests and monks were about the only people who could read and write, which of course made them very valuable captives who could be sold as slaves. So of course that was where a Viking raider would go. I mean, why would you raid an impoverished fishing village if, and all you're going to get is a few bushels maybe of fish, when there was a wealthy monastery nearby full of treasure? The Vikings' own religion was, of course, non-dogmatic. It didn't have rules and regulations. They did not have you stand up when the priest does this, and you kneel when he does that. They had no rule book of how to worship. And they didn't want converts. And, they really had no interest in other people's religious beliefs. They didn't care. Now, they would have considered Christians were a bit weak and spineless. Their turn the other cheek, love thy neighbour attitudes. Well, that certainly would not have been the Viking attitude by a very long way. But they couldn't have cared less what God those other people worshipped, just as long as they didn't try to make them worship him. In that case, you might have certainly had problems. And if the wealth of the day had been in the hands of the Jews or the Muslims, well, the Vikings would have ignored Christian churches. They'd have walked right past them on their way to the nearest synagogue or mosque. But let's forget about raiding for a moment. Difficult though that may be when talking about the Vikings, because it's pretty much the thing that everybody associates principally with them, as I've said. The extent of Norse trading and settlement was unsurpassed by anyone else, founding most of the major towns in Ireland. Navigating the rivers of Europe from the Baltic right down to the Black Sea and Constantinople, which often meant porting their ships, sometimes for miles overland to change rivers, and even reaching distant Baghdad, bringing exotic furs, beautiful gold and silver jewellery, amber, which is rare in the Mediterranean but is quite common in the far north, and, of course, slaves. Yes, slaves. Now, slaves were a very valuable commodity, and they fetched a very good price in the markets of Constantinople. Some were acquired along the way, others brought from distant lands, such as Ireland and Britain. There was a raid in Ireland in 821 AD, for example, when a large number of women were taken from Howth in Dublin Bay. But we can't find fault too much with them for that. Slavery was common right across Europe and the Middle East and pretty much everywhere else at that time. Indeed, it was the norm. Everybody was doing it, despite the efforts of the church to stop it. So, the Vikings, well, they simply went with the flow, so to speak. They were interested in profit, and slaves brought considerable profit. They simply brought what the market wanted, which is what good businessmen do, and they were very good. In fact, under the Viking kings, such as the famous Ivar the Boneless and Olafur the White, and later the Norse Gaelic kingdom of Dublin, Ireland became the largest slave market in Western Europe, centred on Dublin, which was no small achievement, I can tell you. Drawing much of the potential, merchandise, I suppose, for want of a better word, and that's what it was, from the Irish hinterland and from raids on Britain and Scotland. It's also worth noting that slavery existed at one time or another in every country on earth. So, nobody can really point a finger at anyone else and say, they used to have slaves. Oh, yes, they used to have slaves. Well, yes, they did, and so did you, mate. So sit down and shut up. You were all in the same boat, often, quite literally, be it a Viking longship, a Roman galley, an Arab dhow, or an 18th century slave ship. When it comes to slavery, I'm afraid nobody has a moral high ground, since everybody did it in some form at some time. The Norse, of course, were expert shipbuilders, the finest of their day, or perhaps of any day. The famous, or infamous, I suppose, if you were a resident of a coastal town and saw one approaching, yes, the famous Viking longship being perhaps the most perfect ship ever devised for its intended purpose. Fast, able to sail deep inland along rivers due to its shallow draft, able to reverse direction almost instantly by the rowers simply turning around and rowing the opposite way, which could be very useful in emergencies. If you were going up a river and found the natives had perhaps blocked it or put a chain or something across, or they started shooting arrows from the banks, well, everybody just turns around and rows like Fenrir the giant wolf is right behind them the other way, and you're out of danger in no time. You see, that was easy because the Viking longship was the same at both ends. It didn't have a pointy bit at the front and a roundy bit at the back end, like other ships did. It had a pointy bit at both ends. It was the ideal warship, and no town that lay on a river more than 3 feet deep was safe from it, no matter how far inland it might be. And the Vikings developed wonderful navigational techniques that could even take them far out across the vast expanse of the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland and on to North America, finding Newfoundland, where they settled for a time, and now recent evidence indicates that they went much further south to New Brunswick as well, where they seem to have, just sort of had a look and left again after naming it Vinland, due to the wild grapes that grew there. But now here's an interesting little thing connected with that. It was thought that Leif Erikson had exaggerated a bit, shall we say, with his account of this wonderful Vinland, because wild grapes don't grow in Newfoundland, nor were there rivers full of salmon, and there weren't any natives who used animal skins to build their canoes, so that Leif appeared to have been a bit, shall we say, economical with the truth. But more recently, excavations at the confirmed Norse site in Newfoundland turned up butternuts. Yes. So, big wow, you say. Butternuts. Yes. You see, butternuts do not grow in Newfoundland. Oh, no. However, they are found over 500 miles to the south in eastern New Brunswick, which is actually the northern limit of where you can find them. And significantly, wild grapes grow freely in New Brunswick. There are rivers full of salmon, and the natives there used to use animal skins for their canoes. Well, the butternuts didn't bring themselves all the way up to Newfoundland and then bury themselves in a Viking midden heap for some archaeologist woman to find in the 21st century. Obviously, Leif, or some of his men at least, had gone down to New Brunswick and brought things back up to the settlement. So Leif Erikson is cleared of telling porcupines, and New Brunswick clearly is the region that he named Vinland. Well, unless, of course, someone is going to suggest that butternuts are a bit like triffids and they can get up and toddle off all by themselves 500 miles up to Newfoundland. Which seems a tad unlikely, really, doesn't it? They'd also have to be able to swim, or at least build a boat, in order to get from New Brunswick to Newfoundland, since the estuary of the St. Lawrence River, but it sort of gets in the way, and it's a very big, wide river. I said at the start that the Vikings have been misrepresented, and that's very true. lurid tales of their merciless savagery abound, their wanton brutality overshadowing all their other attributes. But that's very questionable as to accuracy. Oh, yes, they were brutal at times. They were very brutal indeed, but so too was everyone else. Yes. Cities razed to the ground, their inhabitants raped and slaughtered all across Europe and the Middle East. Not a Viking in sight, or none anywhere. No. I mean, the Crusaders, well, they massacred and raped other Christians in Constantinople, despite being on a quest to fight Muslims. And even worse was done by them in Jerusalem when they eventually got there, where they cheerfully massacred Arabs and Jews and anybody else who happened to get in their way with equal ferocity. Their savagery even appalling scholars of the time, used as they were to violence, but there weren't any Vikings involved in it. Not a one. Every army in Europe, or probably anywhere else in the world for that matter, killed, looted and raped to various degrees, many far worse than anything the Vikings ever did. Yet strangely, it is the Vikings who have got the label of merciless brutes, despite the fact that they were, well, really little different to anyone else at the time. I suppose they simply did it with more style, leaping off dragon-headed ships. Well, that's very booyah, darling, isn't it? And, of course, they were pagans. Yes, pagans. Oh, something that made them evil and morally reprehensible in the eyes of the church, regardless of anything they actually did. If they had petted kittens and sniffed flowers and wrote poetry, they would still have been evil monsters, as far as the church was concerned, by their paganism. And everything bad about them was automatically far worse than exactly the same thing done by a Christian. They were demonized simply by their pagan beliefs. Also, it must be remembered that the Norse did not regard raiding as theft. Indeed, theft was considered a most dishonourable act, something never done by a true warrior, and the thing that would bring disgrace to his name, while raiding was seen as an act of valour, where risk and danger were encountered, and the victor returned with the spoils won by his courage and daring. If Eric the really dreadful had broken into your house while you slept, taken all your gold very, very quietly so he didn't wake you, sneaked out to avoid a fight and scurried back to his ship, he would have been branded a thief and a coward. But had he kicked in your door, killed anyone who resisted, burned your house down, and then ran to his ship with your gold, well, he'd have gone home with honour and his well-deserved booty because he took risks to obtain it. It does make sense, if you think about it. Robbing, let us say, a frail old woman for her purse, as we see unfortunately so often in our streets today, well, to a Viking that would have been something without honour, branding him a common thief. What, you bash little old ladies over the head and take their purse? Why, because you're such a coward you don't want to fight anyone? No, good heavens, you'd have been completely disgraced if you had done something like that. The same applied to rape. Now, that was a very serious crime back home in Scandinavia, but seen as one of the spoils to be had when raiding. You see, to Viking raiders, there was a distinct difference between their women, who were spoils of war, if you like, and thus they were fair game, and our women, who you touched at your peril, because if a husband or a brother or a son didn't gut you, the woman probably would do it herself. Most women did carry knives at that time. And women could be raiders as well as the men. Oh yes. A Viking fleet was recorded as landing in Ireland in the late 10th century, led by a woman the Irish called the Red Maiden, who the Irish chroniclers regarded as one of the most dangerous of the Viking leaders, and one of the most brutal, though her evilness was probably a tad exaggerated for propaganda purposes. No name is mentioned for her, but given her nickname, she may have been a Norwegian woman named Rusla, daughter of the King of Telemark, who had gathered a Viking fleet after her father was overthrown by the King of Denmark, attacking Danish shipping in revenge. Now, she went on to raid Denmark, the British Isles, and, significantly perhaps, Ireland, acquiring a fearsome reputation as a bloodthirsty individual who took no prisoners, gaining herself the name the Red Woman in the process. Being captured by her, it was decidedly bad for one's health, shall we say. She was eventually brought down by her own brother after the king persuaded him to change sides by adopting him as a foster son. He was said to have grabbed her by her braids and held her as his men beat her to death with rowing oars. Charming. What a superb example of brotherly love, with a brother like him who needed enemies. And in the saga of Hervor, we read how she turned her back on normal female things, trained herself in fighting, and went off with her own ships, raiding and pillaging, becoming a much feared Viking leader. Now, that's a saga tale, yes, but it shows that the concept of a female Vikinger, braver than her own male crew, in fact, where she goes ashore once where her men are too afraid to go, that was something that was accepted. And in a male-dominated society, they would hardly have written a saga like that if it wasn't, possible. As indeed, of course, was the concept of the shield maidens, though that term is seldom ever found in the Norse sagas, but stories of female warriors are plentiful, enough to show that, again, the concept of a woman taking up arms, if need be, was accepted. And there are historical accounts of Norse women in combat as well, and many graves have been found with women buried with military weapons rather than hunting ones. If you were buried with military weapons, there is only one conclusion to be drawn from that. There is the skull and weapons of a woman on display in a museum in Scandinavia, in fact, where she has been officially recognized as a warrior, probably killed by a blow to her forehead, as there is a big indentation in the center of the forehead. Women, of course, were very well treated by Norse society overall, even though it was a very macho, male-based society. Unwanted advances touching or kissing a woman without her consent were regarded as very serious matters. Men had no right to physically interfere with women, and it was considered reprehensible to kill a woman except in very special circumstances. You didn't win any great honor as a warrior by doing that. In intertribal conflicts, blood feuds and the like, of which there were a great many, women would usually be given the chance to leave unharmed before the men would be killed, as in the cases where, say, a house would be surrounded and burned with the occupants inside. Common method of attack, of course, given the flammability of the wooden thatched buildings. The women and children would be offered the chance to leave unharmed. Now, obviously, there were exceptions to that, but overall, the respect for women's rights was quite an outstanding feature of Norse society, more so, of course, because of the macho-ness of it. Christianity, of course, brought changes to the Norse peoples, some good, some bad, but the new religion did, of course, improve trading, since many Christians were very reluctant to trade with pagans, that being officially forbidden by the church. And to trade with the pagans, you had to do it rather secretly, of course. And it became much easier for them to integrate with those that they had settled among, resulting in their becoming less and less Norse and more like those around them, as happened in Ireland, where eventually there was no real difference between Norse and Gael, the two cultures becoming almost one. Exemplified as early as 1014, when Norse and Dublin Irish fought together against King Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf. It has been suggested that the sudden conversion to Christianity of Iceland, which happened in a single day in 1100 AD, yes, all in one day, following a decision by the law speaker of the Althing that Christianity was really a very good idea, yes, and everybody should convert, and so they did, just like that. One day pagan, the next, they were all Christians. Quite amazing, really. But, that may have had more to do with economic matters that improved trade with Christian countries than it had with any genuine religious fervour, given the noticeable lack of any great devotional aspects of later Icelandic society, as well as pagan influences that have continued even to the present day. It certainly can be questioned that an entire nation would adopt a particular religion because, that guy over there, the speaker, he said so. Good idea. Are we all Christians now? Right. Everybody Christian? Yeah. No, not really likely. The Christian era also eventually brought an end to raiding, with little need for it, as Norse society changed to fit the various communities they lived among and gradually became part of. The previously much admired ideals of honour, unbreakable oaths, and implacable warrior courage that had been a hallmark of the Vikings, that no longer had much place in the world. That was a pity, really, since although it had been marked by cruelty and violence, yes, there had been a sense of honour and duty that was Well, it was sadly lacking in the knights of medieval Europe, indeed, who professed, of course, to protect the weak and the innocent, to cherish women and all that sort of thing, while in actuality raping and murdering on a fairly impressive scale themselves, seldom living up to what the church itself expected of them when they took their supposedly sacred and binding knightly vows. A Viking never broke an oath, even when, as in the case of Ragnar Lothbrok, keeping it would mean his own death, while a medieval knight seldom kept one if it interfered with his own desires. He just did his own thing, confessed his sins, got absolution, and then he started all over again. Very convenient system, actually, when you think of it. One could put it in a poetic way, I suppose, and say that then the Viking world sank into the backward-thinking pit of the Dark Ages, and the wonderful dragon ships never sailed again. Yes. Well, goodbye for now, or farewell, as it was in Old Norse.